friends. I'm Sabrina, the rookie around here. John and Dick are the old school American fans of F1. Thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation we had about the 2023 Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. In this race debrief, in addition to our takeaways from the weekend, the guys and I discussed some of the challenges faced by the drivers on this circuit, practically and psychologically. I also enjoyed their comparative analysis of team principles, specifically Otmar and Gunther. Hope you enjoy our conversation. Okay, Saudi Arabia. The Grand Prix, from what I understand, is the fastest street track of the season. It's the second race of the season. And so I'd like to first start actually talking about free practice and then have you talk about that, John. Dick, you feel free to chime in. I'd like to talk about quali because I think there were some interesting things that happened there. And then, of course, I'd like to talk about the Grand Prix itself. So, John, free practice, what did you see and that you remember and is a highlight even days later?
Well, Max in particular, his performance was even better than normal, I think, because he was really under the weather. And despite that, he just was consistently better than Sergio. Mm-hmm. So, it just points to just how good a competitor he is. And again, I'd go back and say we're probably in a period of time that comes once every 20 years or so, where a driver is so exceptional that he just appears to make it look easy no matter what's going on in his head or in his body or around him. And so that's something to appreciate, I think, for sure. Clearly, Hamilton and Mercedes, things are not going well there. And it's the frustrations that are boiling out in the public are kind of alarming, frankly, for the team, because they generally take care of that kind of stuff internally and they don't talk about it outside. But with Lewis really talking about it outside is really a change for them, and I think it's significant. It's going to be real interesting to see. In view of the fact that they're early in the season still, they're having these development problems. They've got an upgrade package coming, and it's a contract negotiation year for Lewis. I just think it's going to be very interesting to watch that and see how it develops. This is one of those tracks where, even though it is one of the faster tracks on the calendar, especially street circuits, it just always seems to me to have congestion in qualifying in particular, and that there's people always unhappy about somebody ruining their lap, and that sure seemed to be consistent on this one too.
Dick, you want to add in on that, or you want to move over towards quali?
Well, mine's kind of a blend between the two, actually, between what went on in FP, the free practices versus quality, and it's more comment about the circuit itself. One of the things that I think is really interesting about this track is that, yes, it's really, really fast. It's also incredibly unforgiving. Mm-hmm. We saw an awful lot of guys, pick a corner, and they spun. and what's so amazing to me is that these guys, you see them drive through these corners and the cars look just stuck. And then all of a sudden, when they break, when they lose track, when they lose their grip, I mean, the car is gone. Yeah. And we always know that they're that they're always on that knife edge, right? Between, in control and complete disaster. And I think there's something about that track that shows it more than most circuits do. And I think it's because there's no runoff area. The track is so unforgiving of mistakes, and yet you have to be on it, man, to set a lap. And so I never like to see people wad up a lot of really expensive machinery, but on the other hand, it sure does make for a deep appreciation of just how close these guys are to to the very, very edge of adhesion. And that's really fun to watch.
Well,
So
let me ask
that's
you
really
this
my comment.
question on that point.
Mhm.
With it being so early in the season and them trying to kind of get back into the groove of racing, how does that affect the racing mind, like the psychological of you're on that edge and you're trying to find that groove, and then you make them, especially if you make a mistake or all the pressure
Mhm.
they have about
Right.
destroying the machinery. How do you think that sets them up for the rest of the year as in general? And then even looking at the rookies, how does that, when this is just race 2 and you know everything you've been aspiring for, boom, you make that miss? Because especially with
Mhm.
the people who spun, it was DeVries, Sargent, Piastri, all 3 of them were the rookies. I just wondered, how
Yep.
are they being set up for success? Would it be better if Saudi Arabia was later in the season?
Well, I think you have to get past it regardless, right? The race and what it can do to your mindset, but it can definitely mess with your brain. I mean, we saw it with Mick Schumacher, right? Has that big wreck, and then 2 races later he wads it again. I mean, breaks the car in half at Monaco. The young man's confidence had to have been taking a real beating, and it didn't help that his team boss was going out in public and criticizing him. I mean, that never helps anybody. You know, at the end of the day, you know, it does point back to an earlier argument that I've made, which is they just don't have enough in the car testing prior to the season starting. I mean, they just don't. And so a lot of this stuff, I think, again, you know, if Saudi was later in the year, I don't think you'd see the kind of mistakes that were being made. And those mistakes have higher consequences because the walls are right there ready to bite you.
Well, John, I think that goes back to an earlier conversation. I don't remember if it was online or offline, where you and I were discussing that when you have testing, it develops the driver, and the driver is going to be able to drive the team. That was one side of the equation. Then you said, you know, in the current era technology, it makes the driver more reliant on the tech and the team, and the tech and the team are really going to be driving the driver. And I wonder if that also kind of hamstrings these rookies in this new era. So that I want to throw that question to you, and then also let you lead us into the Grand Prix discussion, like any highlights that stick in your mind.
Well, when you look at this track, this is not one of my favorite tracks. I don't like all the blind walls that you have to weave through. And I think we've talked about this before, but, you know, if you have an accident at certain points on this track, everybody's going to pile into it just about. And I think it's dangerous from that point of view. So that's a kind of a key there. I do think having this race with young, inexperienced drivers who haven't either been to this track before or who have limited experience on the track, and they're under the pressure to produce, and it's early in the season, and they're trying really, really hard, and they have limited testing time and limited time in the car. It just, to me, is a disaster, a recipe for disaster. And I'm just not a big fan of this track at this point in the year. And I think Dick's right. Later in the year, if they were up to speed and more familiar with the characteristics of the car this season, probably have a lot less of this stuff. And it's expensive, you know. I just don't get that. But anyway, moving on to the race, this was a very interesting race, I thought, from several points of view. Certainly, the fact that qualifying went the way that it did in Q3 for Max set up a really dynamic situation, which turned into an outstanding race if you watched Max run. And it added to the excitement for the fans, I think. But, you know, Sergio did everything he needed to do to get the maximum he could. There was just no way Max was going to catch him, but he did catch everybody else, which really was a statement of strength that Max put on the whole field, including Sergio, because if he'd have started any higher behind Sergio, he'd have taken him. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Alonso, man, this was the guy. I can't remember. Did he get driver of the day for the race? He was just amazing, I thought. And he really, really drove a great race, and he did maximum available possibility for the race, P3. Really a great drive on his part. That was a highlight to me. I thought that, he got a penalty for violating the grid box. I get that, and that is correct. He should have gotten a penalty for that. It's unfortunate, but he knows the rules. He's experienced enough, and although it's millimeters or inches, it makes a difference, and it's part of the rules. So fair enough on that. The penalty that he got in the pits, where the mechanic was judged to be touching his car, I thought that was a bad call at the time, and I was really, really glad that the FIA reviewed it. On review, they decided that was not an advantage, and that because the guy just had the jack stuck, touched to the car, and there was nothing gained at all. No way you could consider that gained. And so I think they made the right decision on pulling that penalty back and restoring his position to him. Notably, I think Magnussen and Hulkenberg have an interesting relationship, and that's going to be an interesting to see if they can keep it together and if Steiner can keep them off each other's backs. But they had a good race, and they kept it clean, which is important. And as long as they do that, I don't think Steiner will have too much problem. Those were the major things I saw with the race.
Dick, you want to give your perspective?
Yeah, I'm always interested in seeing how Magnussen and Hulkenberg get along with one another. It's a little bit like Ocon and Gasly. I mean, none of those guys like each other, but when they hate each other, how's that? How are you going to get anything done? And so, anyway, I guess that's my bigger question. But okay, that's why I'm here, and I'm not a team principal. But historically, those kind of relationships just don't work, whether it's in business or sport or whatever. I mean, sometimes it does, but most of the time, it's a recipe for disaster. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the season, really, for both teams.
Well, that's interesting that you had brought up the team principal distinction, because it seems like if anybody's going to be able to manage a controversy or hatred between two drivers, in my opinion, Gunther seems like he's the guy you don't want to mess with. But Otmar seems to be like this nice guy and almost too diplomatic. But who knows? Maybe I'm totally misjudging these guys. You know them. You've observed them longer than I have.
Interesting. I don't think any of those guys got to that position by being nice guys. I think controlling emotions, being adept at controlling emotions, is probably more like it. At least in Otmar's case, I think he's just better at that. Whereas, Gunther he's a pretty emotional guy, and so I'm thinking that's probably what we're seeing.
That's a good distinction. I hadn't thought of it like that both of them are strong and have that capacity. Otherwise, they wouldn't have ascended to that level and that placement. Yep. But the way they're expressing it, or the maturity of how they control their emotions, or even how they've been enabled to behave that way. Maybe it's part of the culture at Haas that has allowed Gunther to be much more emotional, and everyone just kind of knows it.
Well, yeah, and something else too. Let's not discount the whole Drive to Survive thing for a second, because Gunther has become kind of a pop culture kind of star because he's so off the charts, right? And so I think there's a certain amount of that's hyperbole on his part, just because he knows it's good ink. And probably Haas loves it because, they're a midfield team. Well, how do we get more airtime for our sponsors? Well, let's let Gunther be crazy. I mean, if you can't run it, right? If you can't run up front, then you got to come up with something else. What's my shtick? Okay, well, we're going to have a team principal that's kind of nuts. So, now, having said that, I'd love to sit down and have dinner with Gunther. That would be absolutely a blast. I'd love it. But, anyway, that's kind of what I'm thinking.
That's great. I love it. Okay, final thought on the Grand Prix race itself, gentlemen. Either one?
Really great race from Max and
from Max, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I feel like
very
that's what we're going to
impressive,
say all
and-
season long, unless something changes. Really great race from Max. Really, maybe in some instances, really great race from Sergio. We'll see. It's still early. We'll see. Thanks for a great conversation, guys. That ends this conversation. But rest assured, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in because we're just two guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, thanks for listening.